In the dim corridors of medieval memory, there lies a story seldom told in full, and even when whispered, it drifts between the realms of history and ghostly rumor. It begins in a stone manor perched on a rise above a river that cut like a cold silver knife through the land. Travelers who crossed the valley would see the family's banners hanging still against the wind, a signal of wealth, of permanence, of roots sunk deep into soil that had been watered with both toil and blood. Yet permanence in those centuries was a fragile illusion. The soil itself seemed to hunger for sacrifice, and the chronicles of the time speak often of households rising in a blaze of fortune, only to vanish like smoke on a winter morning. This family's fate would become the darkest example of that pattern. For one evening, they were seated at their long table, warmed by hearth and heavy bread. By dawn they were gone, entirely gone, without a body, without a scream recorded, without a trace left for their neighbors to grieve. Subscribe now to Silent Heirs. The earliest shadows of this family story stretch back before their disappearance, into an era when lineage was as much a burden as a source of pride. The records show their bloodline extending to a minor branch of nobility, though some monks who copied the genealogies noted, in hesitant script, that the line was said to be marked by strangeness. Not madness, not quite, but a recurring sense of disquiet. Eyes too pale, laughter that never rang fully true, children born at odd hours when storms raged against the hills. The village priests muttered of omens, though they did so cautiously, for to suggest divine displeasure with those who owned the land was to risk both soul and body. The manor itself carried its own peculiar silence. Built in thick stone during a period of war, it had a dampness even in the summer months. Visitors described the air inside as heavy with ash, as though the fires in its hearths consumed more than wood. The smell of tallow and smoke clung stubbornly to the tapestries, and in winter the draughts that hissed through cracks sounded like whispers at night. Peasants crossing themselves in the fields at dusk would glance up toward its windows, always half expecting to see something or someone peering back. And yet, for all this, the family prospered. Their prosperity grew on fertile land and on tenants who, while wary of their lords, remained loyal enough. The family's name, preserved in patchy charters, appears frequently in transactions of grain and wool, in marriages carefully woven with other houses of ambition, in disputes over grazing rights settled only after long arguments before abbots and sheriffs. On feast days, when the manor's gates were briefly opened, villagers would shuffle through, receiving bread and watered ale. The villagers noted the precision with which these gifts were given, not generosity but ritual. Always the same measures, never more, never less, as though the family feared the consequences of excess. Neighbors told of odd absences, unexplained journeys the men of the house would take, disappearing for months into distant counties, returning with new relics, small crosses, fragments of bone, silver cups etched with symbols no one could quite decipher. Such objects were displayed proudly, though priests sometimes turned their gaze away, muttering about relics unblessed by Rome. The relics glimmered in torchlight, casting eerie reflections that played across the walls like figures in motion. Children in the manor would wake crying, saying they heard footsteps pacing in the hall, even when all the household slept. By the time their name carried true weight in the shire, whispers already coiled through the surrounding villages. The family prospered, yes, but why did their fields seem to yield even in lean years when neighbors starved? Why did pestilence sweep through cottages but halt at the manor walls? Why did the bells of the parish church sometimes ring on their own when the family gathered? And why did the monks, tasked with recording the harvest tallies, write so reluctantly of this house, their pens hesitating on the parchment as if fearing the ink itself might carry danger? The shadows in their family history were not merely gossip. Several deaths stained their lineage long before the final disappearance. A young daughter drowned in the river under strange circumstances. Her body was found days later, hair tangled with reeds, skin unmarked but her mouth fixed in a rictus grin that horrified the villagers who pulled her from the current. A son, too, perished suddenly, some said from fever, others whispered poison, though no proof was ever named. These losses, instead of weakening the family's grip, seemed only to tighten it. They clung more fiercely to each other, to their manor, to their rituals. It was during these years that their gatherings became increasingly private. Where once neighbors had been invited for harvest feasts, now the gates remained shut. Candles burned through the night inside the manor, faint light flickering through slitted windows. Strange chants were reported, low voices carrying across the fields, barely audible but rhythmic, unsettling. Some swore they smelled incense mixed with something sharper, metallic, drifting on the wind. Shepherds avoided the pastures nearest the manor at night, driving their flocks quickly away as the sun set, muttering prayers under their breath. Even their servants, who might have offered clarity, spoke little. Those who left employment rarely returned to the village, and when they did, they were tight-lipped, their eyes downcast, their voices strained. One old woman, when pressed, muttered only a single word before silencing herself. Marked. Whether she meant the family, the house, or all who entered, none could say. Still, in daylight, the family appeared much like any other of their standing. They paid their dues to the crown, they rode in local processions, they attended mass, though always with a peculiar solemnity. Their clothes were fine but muted, their speech courteous but distant. If joy ever touched them, it was rarely shown in public. The family, it seemed, lived as though shadowed by an unseen weight, one that the community felt but could not name. Centuries later, chroniclers would argue whether these were signs of paranoia, or whether the family indeed carried some knowledge, some secret, too heavy for the rest of the world. The village records, fractured and yellow with age, are full of contradictions, testimonies that both accuse and excuse, descriptions that paint the family as cursed, and yet divinely protected. That contradiction would come to define their fate, for when their final night came, it was not only a family that disappeared, but a certainty, and in its place, a question that has echoed ever since. What force begins in the whispers of childhood deaths, in relics glinting in torchlight, in locked gates and midnight chants, that could end with the utter vanishing of blood and bone? What, in truth, had been stirring in the shadows all along? They rose as many families did in the fractured order of medieval England, by a combination of fortune, marriage, and cunning. The chronicles place them in the midst of alliances that mattered, ties not with kings, but with the petty lords who commanded swathes of fertile land, and the abbots who held influence over both heaven and earth. The family, once a modest line, expanded its reach not through warfare, but through carefully chosen unions. A daughter married into a house with shipping rights along the coast. A son wed a woman whose dowry included forests thick with oak, timber prized for ships and strong roofs. Slowly, the manor became more than a lonely stone keep above the river. It grew into the nucleus of a network of estates, a web woven as tightly as the iron rings of a chainmail shirt. Triumphs followed, and the village beneath the hill thrived under their growing dominion. Markets swelled with wool, grain, and salted meat. The manor's wine cellar deepened with casks imported from Gascony, their sweet rot filling the air as servants rolled them across rough floors. In the winter, when storms beat mercilessly at the countryside, the family's fires burned bright and steady, as though the hearth itself were immune to the wind's hunger. To outsiders, it seemed a golden age for the household. But even amidst triumph, omens lingered. No feast passed without some small misfortune, a candle tipping into spilled wine and sputtering as though drowning, a dish of venison spoiled too quickly, a falcon breaking loose during a hunt and never returning. The villagers whispered about these signs, and though the family laughed them away, They themselves kept meticulous records of each mishap, written in a careful script on parchment bound in black leather. These records survive in fragments, and they read less like an account book than a ledger of dread. The manor itself mirrored this duality of triumph and shadow. Its halls smelled of roasted meat, beeswax, and damp stone. Tapestries depicting saints hung beside darker scenes. Hunts where animals appeared unnervingly human in their gaze. Battles where the slain stretched like tangled roots across fields of red. The rushes on the floor, meant to freshen the air, were often mixed with herbs like rosemary and sage, masking odors the villagers swore were sharper, stranger. Some said the family burned these herbs not for fragrance but for warding. As their prominence grew, so too did suspicion. Chroniclers tell of merchants reluctant to trade with them unless compelled, fearing they would not be paid in coin but cursed with bad fortune. Priests sometimes hesitated before entering the manor's chapel, their Latin faltering as if the air itself weighed heavy upon their tongues. And yet, outwardly, the family showed devotion. They endowed altars, they funded repairs to the parish roof, they bowed their heads at Mass with grave solemnity. The contradiction only deepened the unease. Political life in the shire drew them further into prominence. The men of the house sat on councils, presided over disputes, and served as mediators between quarrelsome lords. Their judgments were precise, but never merciful. The villagers came to fear not only the manor's silence but its decisions. A tenant late on rent might find not only eviction, but his fields mysteriously barren the next season. A rival knight might withdraw a claim after a sudden accident during a hunt, a fall too perfectly timed to be chance. The family never spoke of these misfortunes, never admitted involvement, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. Triumph brought with it grander feasts, and with them, darker rumors. On nights when the manor flared with torchlight and the sound of pipes echoed across the valley, villagers would huddle in their cottages, listening uneasily. Some swore they heard not music but chanting. Others claimed the laughter drifting down the hill was too sharp, too brittle like pottery breaking. When dawn came, the villagers noticed odd traces, footprints in the mud leading to no destination, claw marks on the stable doors, a bloodied rag floating downstream. Yet the family would ride out after such nights looking fresh, adorned in silk, their hawks perched calmly on their arms. Not even their triumphs in marriage went untainted. One union brought land so fertile that neighboring families envied their abundance. Yet the bride, pale and silent, was said to have never spoken again after her wedding night. Chroniclers note her presence at feasts, her eyes downcast, her hands resting on her lap as though carved from wax. When she bore children, they too were quiet, unsettlingly still infants who watched without laughter. These children grew to walk the halls like pale shadows of their parents, their footsteps soft, their gazes unblinking. The omens grew more pronounced as the family's influence reached its peak. A church bell cracked after tolling for their harvest feast, the split sounding like a cry. A cow gave birth to a calf with two heads, one living, one dead. A storm struck the manor's tower, leaving the stone blackened but the family unharmed. The villagers began to murmur of bargains, pacts struck in whispers at crossroads, promises sealed in blood beneath the oaks. They remembered the relics brought from distant counties, the strange symbols etched into silver cups, the monks who had turned their eyes away. And yet no accusation ever held. No court condemned them, no priest declared them heretical. Their power shielded them, their alliances ensured silence. Even those who feared them most depended upon their bread, their markets, their patronage. To turn against them would have been to starve. And so the villagers endured, crossing themselves as the manor bells rang, telling their children to keep their distance, never to meet the family's gaze too long. What is most haunting in this stage of their rise is not what they gained, but what they could not conceal. For every triumph came with its shadow, every feast with its omen, every alliance with its silence. To the chroniclers who pieced their story together centuries later, it seemed less the path of ordinary nobility than a procession toward something inevitable. Their ascent was not to be celebrated, but to be feared, as though the higher they climbed, the greater the force that awaited to drag them down. Was it triumph they built, or a slow weaving of their own undoing, each feast, each alliance, each victory tightening the snare that would one night close without warning? The night itself was not marked by storm or eclipse. It was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of evening when villagers retired early, their cottages filled with the smell of stewing onions and smoke from damp firewood. In the manor, preparations for a family supper followed a well-practiced rhythm. Servants carried trenchers of bread, pitchers of ale, roasted meats garnished with herbs pulled from the gardens. The sound of iron cutlery clinking against plates echoed through the stone hall, mingling with the occasional murmur of conversation. To those outside, all seemed well, but it would be the last time anyone heard life from within those walls. The chroniclers describe it with clinical detachment, but the villagers' oral tales breathe with dread. The family had gathered, men, women, children, seated at their long oaken table. Torches flickered in their sconces, their flames trembling in the draughts that always haunted the hall. Wine poured red into goblets, staining lips, filling the air with the heavy sweetness of fermented grapes. Somewhere in the distance, a hound barked. Then silence. A silence that stretched into the hours before dawn, broken by nothing, not even the ordinary sounds of servants closing shutters or scouring pans. Morning arrived gray and chill. The first villagers came to the manor gates with milk, with bread, with messages to deliver. They knocked, and their knuckles met cold iron. No servant answered, no guard stirred. The gate remained locked, as though the household had decided to vanish into privacy. But by midday the unease grew. The manor was never silent for long. Smoke always rose from its chimneys, dogs barked from its kennels, horses whinnied from the stables. Now the air hung still. The villagers pressed closer, their voices lowered to whispers. When at last the bravest forced entry, they found the hall as though frozen in time. The table remained laid. Plates half full, bread torn but not eaten, goblets toppled, their contents staining the rushes in sticky pools. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly, casting a dim light on the abandoned scene. But of the family there was nothing. Not a body, not a scream, not even the shuffle of a dying breath. Chairs were pushed back, some fallen to the floor as though their occupants had risen suddenly, but to go where? The smell was wrong. The hearth should have filled the hall with warmth, but the air was tinged with something metallic, sharp, almost like blood, though no wounds were seen. In the upper chambers, beds lay unrumpled, linens untouched, as though no one had retired that night. Cradles were empty, the faint smell of milk lingering where infants should have slept. In the kitchens, knives rested on chopping blocks, still wet with grease, yet no hands remained to wield them. Even the dogs were gone, their leashes hanging slack from pegs by the door. Word spread quickly, carrying dread through the valley. Priests arrived, their faces pale, their Latin prayers quivering as they sprinkled holy water on the doorway. Chroniclers note how their quills trembled as they recorded the scene, some leaving wide blank spaces in their manuscripts where words seemed to fail. Neighbors crossed themselves, whispering that the family had been taken, not by man, but by forces older, darker, more patient. Others insisted it must be crime, that rival lords had stormed the manor in secrecy, slaughtering or abducting the household. But where then were the bodies? Where the blood? Where the broken doors, the shattered locks? Everything remained intact, as though the walls themselves had swallowed the family whole. The days stretched into weeks. Search parties scoured the riverbanks, dragging hooks through the currents where once a daughter had drowned years before. They combed the woods, lifting mossy stones and turning over leaves, looking for graves shallow or deep. They found nothing but silence. Rumors spread of lights in the forest at night, of figures glimpsed between trees, pale and fleeting, too quick to follow. Shepherds claimed their flocks grew restless near the manor's lands, bleating and stamping as though sensing what men could not see. Chroniclers from other counties journeyed to witness the mystery. Some described the manor as cursed, its stones stained not by weather but by secrets. Others accused the family of heresy, suggesting they had vanished because they had dared too far into forbidden rites, consumed in their entirety by what they summoned. Merchants scoffed at such notions, claiming instead that the family had fled debts or disgrace, abandoning their lands to start anew in distant lands. But the question lingered. Why leave food uneaten? Why leave infants' cradles? Why leave everything as though interrupted mid-breath? The servants' fates baffled most. None returned to their villages, none appeared in nearby markets. It was as if every living soul tied to the manor had been erased in the same instant. In their absence, the manor began to rot. Rushes curled dry on the floors, tapestries sagged under the weight of mildew, and the smell of decay seeped slowly into every chamber. The villagers dared not enter after that first intrusion. They locked the gates again, nailed boards across them, and avoided the path that led to the hill. The silence of the manor became a silence in the people as well, as though speaking of it too loudly might invite the same fate upon their own families. Still, questions persisted. Some insisted they heard cries carried on the wind at night, faint and echoing, like voices calling from within stone walls. Others swore the family had been seen in fragments, in a shadow flickering across a meadow, in a reflection caught too sharply in a pool of water, in a dream that left the sleeper gasping. Chroniclers wrestled with these accounts, unsure whether they recorded history or haunting. As months turned into years, the land lay fallow, avoided by tenants who once worked it. Fields grew wild, brambles choking where wheat once rippled in golden waves. The manor became a skeleton on the hill, its windows black, its halls empty but not abandoned in the minds of those who lived nearby. No lord claimed it, no bishop consecrated it anew. It was left as a monument to absence, a wound that never closed. What happened on that ordinary night when bread cooled on the table and embers dimmed in the hearth? Was it murder by unseen hands, flight into darkness, or an erasure beyond the laws of nature? What force could consume a family so completely, leaving behind only silence? In the years that followed, the manor's silence became louder than any bell, its emptiness a proclamation across the valley. The absence of the family gnawed at the villagers' sense of order, for in medieval life every family had its place, each name anchored to land, duty, memory. To see a house vanish, not decline nor fall in battle but disappear utterly, was to confront a void in the very structure of the world. The whispers began, growing into a storm of speculation, blame and fear that spread far beyond the shire. Priests came first, their authority demanded by the church. They walked through the echoing halls with candles that guttered in the drafts, chanting psalms to cleanse what they believed was haunted. Some reported sudden chills, their flames extinguished by breaths of air that seemed to sigh from the very stones. Others refused to continue, declaring that the manor was a site of damnation, that the family had been consumed by God's wrath for sins unspoken. The local bishop convened inquiries demanding confessions from the villagers, who had seen the family last, who had quarreled with them, who had envied their lands, but no answers came, only lowered eyes and muttered prayers. Whispers of witchcraft rose quickly. A family so marked by omens, a family who had dabbled in relics of uncertain holiness, a family whose feasts resounded with strange chants. It seemed too fitting. Some villagers swore they had seen the lady of the house walking by moonlight, holding a silver vessel that glowed unnaturally. Others recalled the servant's mutterings, the single word, marked. The bishop's men seized upon these tales, though no living suspect remained to accuse. Instead, they turned their suspicions on neighbors, on widows who brewed herbs, on shepherds who spoke too often to the wind. Several trials were held, men and women alike accused of consorting with the vanished family in hidden rites. Torture drew out confessions, and the stake burned bright in the valley. Yet even as the smoke drifted upward, the manor stood unchanged, its silence mocking the justice imposed below. Blood feuds blossomed too, fueled by envy and old grudges. Rival families claimed that the vanished had cursed them, pointing to their own sudden misfortunes. Livestock dying, children sickening, roofs collapsing under mild storms. Others turned the tale to their advantage, declaring the disappearance proof of the family's wickedness and pressing claims on their lands. Quarrels spilled into violence, blades flashing in market squares, arrows loosed on lonely roads. Chroniclers recorded these disputes with weary hands, noting that the curse of the vanished family spread outward, infecting those who sought to explain or exploit it. The manor itself bore witness to this unraveling. Raiders came, scavengers looking for treasure left behind. Some carried away silver or tapestries, only to die within the year, struck by accident or sudden illness. Stories spread that those who looted the house found their sleep disturbed by visions. The family seated still at their table, silent, eyes fixed not on their food but on the intruder, as though waiting for them to take a place among the vanished. Few dared enter after these tales grew, and the manor decayed in peace, its roof sagging, its timbers groaning with age. Chroniclers struggled to reconcile fact with the spreading fog of rumor. Some insisted the family had been abducted by rivals, their disappearance a clever ploy to mask murder. Others saw in the tale an allegory, a warning against pride and secrecy. But still others, particularly those with monastic pens, hinted at darker truths, that this was no allegory, but an intrusion of forces beyond mortal ken. They wrote cautiously, their lines interrupted by blank spaces, as though afraid to commit too much detail to the permanence of parchment. For the villagers, the disappearance became a ritual in itself. Each year on the anniversary of that silent night, they avoided the path near the manor. Children were warned never to linger by its gates, lest they too be swallowed by absence. Priests rang bells at midnight, their tones trembling against the hills, warding off whatever force lingered still. Yet some youths, brash with defiance, crept up to the manor ruins under moonlight, daring each other to peer through its windows. They returned pale, swearing they had heard laughter, brittle and distant, or had glimpsed figures moving in the long-dead hall. The family's name, once carried proudly in councils and courts, became unspeakable. Monks recopied charters with deliberate gaps, erasing the lineage as though it had never been. Where the name remained, it was often scratched out, leaving only scars in the parchment. The silence extended into memory itself, a disappearance not only of flesh but of legacy. Yet silence is not erasure, and the villagers never truly forgot. They carried the story in hushed tones, a warning told by firelight, that wealth and triumph may mask curses, that omens ignored will one day collect their due. In time, the curse was whispered of even in distant counties. Travelers spoke of the manor as a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Chroniclers from across England recorded the tale, some embellishing it, some questioning it, none dismissing it outright. For what could they say, faced with a family whose entire existence seemed to vanish in a single night, leaving only mystery and fear behind? What justice could ever be found in trials burned to ash, in feuds that spilled innocent blood, in whispers that poisoned generations? Was the true curse in the family's fate, or in the way their disappearance consumed all who lingered near their shadow. Centuries passed, and still the story lingered, like smoke that refuses to clear no matter how strong the wind. The manor, once proud and commanding, collapsed slowly into ruin. Roof beams caved under the weight of rain and rot, ivy wrapped itself around crumbling towers, and owls nested in the rafters where noble banners once hung. To travelers it appeared as nothing more than another abandoned relic of feudal times, a ruin among many. But to those who lived in the valley, it was never just a ruin. It was a scar, a wound in the earth that whispered at night. Villagers avoided it, though some claimed necessity drove them to its edges. A shepherd once cut through its grounds at dusk and returned trembling, muttering that he had heard a child's laughter echoing from the empty hall. A woodcutter found his axe dulled to uselessness after splitting timber near its gate, as if the iron itself recoiled from the place. Priests who blessed its walls reported that their holy water evaporated before it touched the stone, leaving behind the smell of sulfur. None stayed long. The silence inside was unbearable, pressing down until even the bravest felt the weight of unseen eyes. Yet scholars could not leave the mystery untouched. In the 17th century, antiquarians traced the fragments of the family's name through charters and letters, noting the abrupt cessation of their lineage. Some speculated they had fled abroad during a time of political upheaval, vanishing not by curse but by choice. Others argued their disappearance was a cautionary tale crafted by the church, a story to frighten peasants into obedience. Still others, fascinated by folklore, saw in the tale echoes of older legends, of fairy abductions, of families swallowed whole by the wild hunt, of villages punished for bargains made at sacred crossroads. The 18th and 19th centuries revived the story anew, as travelers with a taste for the Gothic stopped to sketch the ruins. They described the chill that clung to the stones, the strange absence of birdsong near its walls, the way the wind seemed to circle rather than pass through. Local guides recited the tale for coin, their voices hushed even as they courted curiosity. They told of the feast left unfinished, of cradles abandoned, of servants vanished, of the silence that still spread through the valley on the anniversary of that night. Journalists of the Victorian age pressed further, eager to dress the story in the fashion of their own obsessions. They linked the disappearance to secret societies, to hidden vaults beneath the manor, to unspeakable rites that echoed the whispers of witchcraft. They interviewed villagers whose families had passed down the tale for generations. Some swore their ancestors had seen pale figures on moonlit nights, drifting across the fields as though searching for a place that no longer existed. Others claimed that misfortune still fell on those who trespassed into the ruins. Sudden illness, broken bones, deaths that came too soon. By the 20th century, the legend had become both local folklore and national curiosity. Academics debated it as an unsolved disappearance, one of the great mysteries of medieval England. Some framed it as political conspiracy, a rival lord wiping out a bloodline so completely that even their memory was smothered. Others saw it as mass flight, a desperate escape from debts, plague, or royal disfavor. Yet none of these theories could explain the eerie details preserved in oral tradition. The table laid, the food untouched, the silence absolute. Could an entire family, infants and servants included, truly flee in the span of a single night without leaving trace or trail? And so the other explanations endured, the darker ones. That the family had lived under a curse inherited from generations, its claws tightening until the night of final reckoning. That the relics they brought into their home had not been holy but profane, drawing something to them that would not leave until it had devoured them whole. That the voices villagers heard afterward were not echoes of memory, but remnants of lives still trapped, not fully gone, suspended between this world and another. The ruin itself seemed to defy time. Though centuries of rain and frost ate at the stones, though ivy strangled the walls, the core of the hall remained standing, as though the ground itself resisted letting it fall. Visitors described the sensation of stepping across its threshold, a tightening in the chest, the sudden stillness of the air, the sense that one was intruding upon a place not abandoned but occupied by an absence heavier than presence. Some fled after only minutes, unable to bear it. Others lingered, fascinated, hoping to catch a glimpse of something beyond the veil. Today, the land remains avoided. Farmers plow around it, tourists pause at a distance, historians write cautiously of it. The family's name, once scratched from parchment, has been pieced together from fragments, yet still it carries unease. It is not spoken casually. Even scholars confess a chill when they speak it aloud, as if summoning something better left unsummoned. The mystery endures unsolved. Was it a crime too perfectly executed to leave blood behind? Was it political erasure, carefully crafted and fiercely guarded? Was it folklore solidifying into history, or history dissolving into folklore? Or was it, as the villagers always feared, the hand of something unseen, something old, something patient, claiming what had always been marked? The family's legacy is not stone, not blood, not even memory. It is absence, an absence so profound that it has become presence, lingering across centuries, drawing the curious and frightening the faithful. To this day, the question lingers, unanswered, unavoidable. Was it coincidence, conspiracy, or curse? Subscribe now to Silent Heirs for more interesting videos.